Hello and welcome to New Wave Global. You are watching Unraveled and I'm your host, Marvi Sirmed. Tonight, we will cover a subject that has sparked significant controversy across South Asia, the upcoming visit of controversial Islamic cleric and preacher Dr. Zakir Naik to Pakistan. A figure both revered by millions and reviled by governments, at least some governments, the government of India and Bangladesh in particular. Zakir Naik is known for his charismatic sermons on Islam and has been accused of far more dangerous actions by the Indian government. His problematic speech led to his conviction and subsequently his self-imposed exile in Malaysia. Despite some serious allegations against him, Naik continues to have a massive following among the Muslims. He is reported to have accepted an invitation by the government of Pakistan to this visit, and he is in Pakistan as we speak, and was received by with fanfare by a coterie of federal ministers and senior officials. Nonetheless, his visit to Pakistan, a country already infested with religious extremism, raises important questions about the politics of religious influence in the region, and especially in Pakistan. What is the problem with Naik's ideology and narrative? Why do some countries of the region fear Naik's speech instigates terrorism? Why India is intent on his extradition? What does Zakir Naik's much hyped visit to Pakistan tell us about all of this? To help us unravel these critical questions, I'm pleased to have with us Praveen Swami, a senior Indian journalist with deep insights into South Asian politics, terrorism, religious extremism. He has extensively covered issues related to all of these and Zakir Naik and his impact, not just in India, but also globally. A warm welcome, Praveen.
Thank you, Marvi. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak with you about these things.
Thank you. As I said earlier, India has charged Zakir Naik with, probably instigating terrorism and money laundering as well.
That's right.
And promoting hate speech, etc. So, do you think there is an evidence behind these allegations? Because a lot of people on social media, when I, posted an update on Zakir Naik criticizing his recent visit, a lot of people, Pakistani mostly, told me that because he challenged Indian establishment, the religious Hindutva establishment, that is the reason India is, all of these, India is avenging his speech. It's not much about the, alleged crimes. It's about that politics. What do you think?
Well, I think it's important, firstly, to separate Zakir Naik from the broader spectrum of intolerance that the government of India, particularly over the last few years, has demonstrated. One of the things it's important, I think, to remember is that Zakir Naik is not the only or the foremost voice of resistance to Hindutva or to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government. There are many, many people from a spectrum of opinion, both from within the Muslim community and from outside the Muslim community, who've been voices of opposition to the government and trenchant critics of Hindutva. And inside the Muslim community, that spectrum of opinion ranges from influential secularists. I guess you could think of, for visible faces, people like Javed Akhtar or his wife Shabana Azmi, many, many others, running all the way to people in the clerical establishment, established theologians, who have been extremely critical of the government. Zakir Naik, I think, comes from one particular tradition, which is more problematic, and of course we'll discuss that more. Now, I think people who say that, look, Zakir Naik is not a terrorist, are probably making a fair argument. Zakir Naik has never been accused of running a terrorist group or running a terrorist organization like the Lashkar-e-Taiba or Al-Qaeda.
Mm.
Yet the fact is that his sermons and speeches have been repeatedly found to inspire people who have engaged in terrorism.
Mm.
That includes the perpetrators of many incidents of terrorism, particularly in Maharashtra. That includes people who were linked to the Indian Mujahideen, so-called Indian Mujahideen network, that staged multiple terrorist bombings in cities from 2008 onwards, and of course have been widely popular around the region with various political Islamists, with jihadists. Now, you can turn around and say Zakir Naik is not responsible. He's never given a speech saying go bomb a city or go shoot civilians. Yes, that's true. The money laundering charges relate to specifically to money brought in to fund his institution, which was the Islamic Research Foundation. And I'm not an expert on financial law or on the banking system and compliance with those banking transactions. But I do know it's a fact that Zakir Naik very publicly collected money. Now, whether that money was misused or illegally brought in or compliance was not there, I don't want to get into that debate. I simply don't know. That's not my area of competence. But certainly on this question of inciting violence and terrorism, I think there are some meaningful questions to be asked about why so many people involved in violence have found Dr. Naik's speeches and ideas so attractive and congenial. And that's the question also has to be answered, of course, why millions of people around the world have found him such a rock star like figure. And I think we can unpack that as our conversation goes on.
Yeah, and it's like it's eerie. His the TV channel that he founded, the name of that TV channel is Peace, and he frames himself as if he is the great ambassador of peace and the humane face of Islam. What I mean, I just do not.
I think Dr. Naik appeals to very much the same cohort, if you like, of young people who are drawn to violent Hindutva or to a certain brand of violent evangelical Christianity in the United States. And I think one of the things that got lost in the telling of the Zakir Naik story is the organic ways in which some of these things were linked. So Zakir Naik, as you correctly point out, was the founder or one of the founders of what you might call Islamic televangelism. He became an icon through the adroit use of Peace TV, which was broadcast TV, religious TV, before its time in South Asia, but kind of a well-known phenomenon in the West by then in the form of evangelical television. And he was very adroit with the internet, very early in its years, reaching out to this mass youth audience at a time when most people of my age anyway were blind to the impact that the internet was eventually going to have. Now, where does Deedat come from? Deedat is not a trained scholar of Islam. He's not a trained cleric in any classical sense who's been through the disciplines of theological study, theological disputation, right or left wing. His mentor was someone called Ahmad Deedat, who's a very influential South African cleric. And Ahmad Deedat cut his teeth, if you like, his pop teeth, debating Jerry Falwell, who was one of the great figures of evangelical, extreme right-wing Christianity in the United States. And Jerry Falwell used to go around doing these big pop star evangelical shows. And Deedat and him would debate whether Islam was supreme or Christianity was supreme. And depending on what your personal beliefs are, at the end of this, very staged rock starry kind of stuff, you can find it if you look on some corners of the internet. You could decide that your team had won, if you like, which side you like. Now, remember that Falwell represented some of the worst tendencies in Christianity, which have flowered today under former President Donald Trump's rule, but also on far more extreme sections of Christianity. But Falwell was a misogynist. He was what we would today describe as a racist, but always very careful in his use of language and idiom so that you did not say things that were directly, offensive. And that was something, I think, a tip that Deedat turned up. But Deedat, for his part, also represented, if you like, a kind of pop Salafism. So Salafism, of course, from the time of Ibn Taymiyyah onwards, is part of a serious theological tradition. But this was kind of repackaging it for this red hot chili peppers generation, if you like, making it, very with it, very attractive. You could trot out two lines and pretend you had the authority that you had knowledge of the inner disputations and issues of Islamic theology. And this became widely popular in the UK, particularly, where it appealed to this young generation of Muslims who were often very upset with racism, with economic discontentment, with marginalization, but didn't find any comfort or identification with the rooted cultural practices of their parents, which rooted back to Pakistan, for example, or to Indian Gujarat. And Ahmad Deedat offered this kind of deracinated pop culture Islam that was supremely attractive to this sense of youth, that gave them a sense of identity that had no local moorings, that seemed to cut across national boundaries. And then came Zakir Naik, who picked this up and packaged it like a pop star. I mean, frankly, you look at a lot of Zakir Naik's videos and leave aside the dancing. But if you look at the camera placements, the lighting, it is the aesthetic of Bollywood. It is not the aesthetic of some boring Maulvi giving you a long lecture somewhere. And typically there's some sort of miracle act somewhere involved, where some woman adopts Islam, or some person with serious afflictions is cured by these miraculous things. This is all drawn from American Christian evangelical television, as were the production values. Amazing colors. Zakir Naik always in this suit, and speaking English, which was, of course, the language of a international sort of youth generation that was drawn to these causes. To my mind and my reading, this was not Islam, this was pop television. And the problem was, I think, really, which, again, the others, it was rabidly misogynist. It was woman-hating in a way, very few people are. Zakir Naik talks, for example, of the problem of surplus wives, because he claims that the West is awash in homosexuality, and therefore it will, collapse because people won't have any children. But there are a lot of surplus women, and therefore this is an argument for polygamy. Now, this is an argument you will not find anywhere in centuries of classical Muslim theology, anti-gay as it might be. But Ahmad Deedat made it, and this appeals to a certain crude street way of thinking, and also to a generation of young men who we eventually saw go into ISIS because they thought they could get sex slaves by joining ISIS. It basically appeals to misogyny, not to any deep religious understanding. You found Zakir Naik constantly talking about the supremacy of Islam over other religions, which might be an argument theologians have at various points made, but you'll also find many Muslim theologians who have deeply engaged with what other faiths have to say and with the problems of coexistence in a multi-faith world. You won't hear any of that in Zakir Naik. It's like, I can prove to you Islam is superior because of some three shallow arguments he will make. And finally, he used his credentials as a doctor, one-time practitioner. I don't think he ever practiced medicine seriously. At least there's no historical record of it. But you'll always find him claiming science to his side. So, for example, you will find him claiming that Darwin was wrong on the theory of evolution, and this was, that he can prove this. Now, these arguments are frankly, his arguments on science are nothing that anyone who's got a 10th grade science education should make. There are far more sophisticated arguments to make, criticizing Darwin if that's what you want to do. But it again appeals to, this instant pop fandom kind of thing, because I guess it makes the audience feel like they have arguments to marshal to their side.
Yeah.
Like I said, I think it appealed to a generation of young Indian Muslims who were very upset by religious discrimination, by poverty, by backwardness. It appealed to British Muslims and maybe American Muslims for many of the same reasons at the same time.
Hmm.
Um, and because there was no complex political voice within these communities, saying that, look, there are other arguments against racism. You don't need to turn to this kind of uh, candy pop, red hot chili peppers, Islam to combat these things. He
Hmm.
was vastly successful. And you have to give him, I guess, credit would be the word, for
Hmm.
building a for, sensing this opportunity, sensing this audience, and building a huge, enormously profitable media empire around it.
Yeah. Can you, sorry, can we go back to where he originated? Where from India he comes from?
So, like Ahmad Deedat, he has Gujarati Muslim roots.
Mm.
But there are various communities of Muslims, especially trading communities, who were enormously important in the evolution of trade and commerce across South Asia. Large communities, I understand, still in Karachi today of Bori Muslims with historic roots across the border. Karachi and Bombay were great centers. And like many other Gujarati Muslims, Didat's ancestors ended up in Mumbai, Bombay as it was then called. And he had what you would call a modern secular education, uh, uh, trained as a medical doctor,
Mm.
but then fell into proselytizing. Now, we know very little of Zakir Naik's backstory because he hasn't told us much. The Islamic Research Foundation early on had some sort of links with Tablighi preaching groups. As you know, the Tablighi Jamaat, since very early in the last century, traveled across the region preaching what it claimed to be the authentic, true Islam, and trying to convert Muslim communities, or if you like, reconvert Muslim communities to true, authentic Islam and Islamic practices. Those
And this would be
included, for example,
1980s.
yes. And this became a global sort of transnational activity. What you see as the short pajama above the ankles was, purported by Tablighis
Mm.
to be the way the Prophet had worn his clothing, so it wouldn't get dirty off the ground, therefore was something to be emulated. Zakir Naik brought some modern zing to these Tablighi practices. So you'll see his very modern and nicely cut suit,
Yeah.
not pajamas, cut just above his ankles. And he emerged in that. Excuse me, just a second, Madhvi.
Sure. Sure.
Tasha, yeah, sorry. My daughter was calling.
No, no
So
worries.
he had these suits that were neatly cut above the ankle to bring some modern twist to this whole thing, a modern sensibility. So a lot of Tablighi teachings you will find in Islamic Research Foundation literature. There's very little new or novel in the substance of what
Mm.
Zakir Naik says, but he
Mm.
brought this aggression and he brought this sort of passion and spectacle, theatrical, televisual spectacle to these teachings. And I mean, I guess you could call it pop Salafism or pop Tablighism. Um,
Mm.
in Maharashtra, he was, in Bombay in those years, he was largely cozy with the political establishment. The Islamic Research Foundation had notably no history of confrontation with the political governments in Maharashtra. It was quite chummy with them.
Okay.
And for those people who say that Zakir Naik is a strident criticism of Hindutva,
Mm.
it's worth asking where he was when the Hindutva movement to demolish the Babri Masjid and build the Ram temple in its place. It's worth asking where Zakir Naik was at that point, because you will find absolutely no reference
Mm.
anywhere in any media search you might do to his being involved in many Muslim and secular organizations. that were battling that tide. In 1992, 93, terrible Hindu-Muslim violence in Bombay, the Shiv Sena party being, complicit in the killings of Muslims. You won't find Zakir Naik as a strident critic of these guys. And well up to 2002, 2003, when the Indian Mujahideen phenomenon, urban bombings, terrorism became a cause, he retained that chumminess. I think largely because politicians saw him as a fairly sort of pliant figure who was charismatic, who was popular, but not challenging their authority in any significant way. That really, awaited the coming of a government that was less tolerant, if you like, or found it convenient to take on these sort of preachers of hatred and bring them down. That wasn't that had no political equities in propping him up. But certainly up to the coming of the Narendra Modi government, and we have to remember Narendra Modi, Prime Minister Modi, did not invent Hindu nationalism or Hindutva. There was a long and sordid story dating back to well before independence. Zakir Naik was not a critic of any of this.
Yeah, and this is a very important point that you mentioned. And during the, he was traveling and preaching in 1980s, since 1980s at least. And these were the jihad days in the region. And in the 1990s, early 90s, Vishwa Hindu Parishad and the Rath Yatra, etc., all of these things were happening. But we don't hear much of Dr. Zakir Naik in those days.
No, you can scour his website. You can scour archived editions of Islamic Research Foundation literature. At least I haven't found anything. I'd be delighted if someone else did. But I don't think there's anything there.
Yeah. So Dr. Zakir Naik then, I mean, he do you think, I mean, there's a terminology that you hear in India, which is called, Sarkari Musalman. Do you think he ever was a Sarkari Musalman? It's fair to call him.
I mean, I don't particularly like that phrase because I think it's used to insult people sometimes. But
yeah,
I know what people mean when they use it, and it's a very valid point. Well, let's put it this way. Zakir Naik was careful never to become associated with the Congress order in any direct way, as he was careful not to become associated with the jihadi causes of the 80s. I mean, he was not a Jamaat-e-Islami kind of guy who believed in involvement in political Islam. In fact, he's studiously apolitical right through, his career. He's apolitical, though, in very disingenuous ways. And what do I mean by that? So, questioned about what he thought about Osama bin Laden, he gives a famous speech saying, well, I don't know whether this was after 9/11. He said, well, I don't know if Osama did it or didn't do it or whatever. Never mind that Osama himself said he did it. Al-Qaeda himself said they did it. But I don't know if he did it or he didn't do it. But if he's fighting evil, then it can't be a bad thing. Now, is the West evil? Is the West not evil? Are the people killed? He ducks around this, and he was never a guy who would give press conferences or take tough questions or anything. So it's all in his own control kind of thing. He said, who is a terrorist? Is terrorism wrong? Well, according to Dr. Zakir Naik, the duty of every Muslim is to terrorize the terrorist. So if you are terrorizing terrorists, you are a good Muslim. Now, is Osama terrorizing terrorists? Is he the United States and the West? Is he not terrorizing terrorists? Who can say? And remember, at this point, until in the years before 9/11, Zakir Naik traveled the world. He had a televangelical network that reached out across the world. So if he had any deep existential problems with the West and with Western ideology, we certainly didn't know it until that time. And I think after 9/11, he tried tapping this kind of underswelling of undercurrent of anger in some sections of Muslims against the West, and the feeling that the West was hypocritical or had double standards, but always careful not to cross the line. Similarly, you can find with him criticism of many Hindu beliefs, of an insistence on the superiority of Islam, but he'll never say, oh, you should mobilize against Hindu nationalism, or you should fight the people who are running the Babri Masjid movement. I don't think there's any mention in his speeches uh, ever of any specific Hindu nationalist politicians or of the perpetrators of violence against Muslims, or about the problem of communalism in South Asia.
Yeah.
And I think there's a very real problem there, because the problem being that there were other people, Muslims and otherwise, as I said at the beginning, who were risking a lot out there to try and deal with these issues and deal with this problem. And this guy was basically reaching out to young idiots, I hesitate to use the word, who wanted to feel powerful and strong and, oh God, I am a tough Muslim, but I actually won't get off my ass, excuse me, and participate in any actual political movement that has any actual political point to make. I'll just walk around being cool, wearing my different pajamas and telling everyone how much more pious I am and holy I am than them.
Yeah, I'm just very curious to know how did it start? I mean, he is in 1980s, 90s, he's already traveling India, if not the world, which means before that he established himself. He is a medical doctor. He comes from Gujarat, but he has good relations with Maharashtra government, which means he is already established. Did he emerge, as part of the Tablighi network, or did he emerge from the institution of masjid, or did he started? I mean, did he on the way he realized that his bread and butter can be his silver tongue, that blurts
So
out
Ahmad
completely.
Didat, who was his, if you like, mentor, his role model, also visited India several times. Now, this is where I say the history is a little thin, and partly because Zakir Naik hasn't talked about it, and
Mm,
people who might know haven't talked about it.
mm,
But Ahmad Didat traveled to India sometimes. Didat was of Gujarati origin again, and there is a large South African Muslim Gujarati community in which Didat had cut his roots. What we do know for a fact is
mm,
that Zakir Naik never studied at a seminary. There is no theologian of repute in Bombay
mm,
or Maharashtra or Gujarat who says they have had anything to do with Zakir Naik or taught Zakir Naik. There is no university or institution like Al Azhar at which Zakir Naik studied. And that really marks him out from other prominent figures uh, in the history of South Asian political Islam.
mm,
So you can, you may not have high regard, as I do not have high regard for the teachings of a Maulana Samiul Haq or a Maulana Nizamuddin Shamzai.
mm,
But there is no doubt that they at least went through the disciplines of a religious education. Again, one may dispute its
mm,
quality, its credentials, its teachings, but this guy never did that. He
mm,
came from a middle class business family of no great importance. Did Tablighi tours, Dauras as they are called, a few of them within India. But then started learning from Didat the art of doing a Tablighi show, if you like. And in
mm,
the 80s, the reach was very limited outside Mumbai. I mean, I think, those of us, of course, not you, but people like me who are old enough to remember the 80s, know that there was the reach of a cleric or a figure was very limited. The only things that came out of the IRF were books and pamphlets.
mm,
And even within the Islamist milieu, it existed in a very competitive, if you like, Islamist climate.
mm,
The Students' Islamic Movement of India and the the Jamaat Islami's student wing at that point, the Students' Islamic Organization, were far, far more powerful. They had political networks which spanned India, which had a cadre, a leadership. Ahmad Didat was, excuse me, Zakir Naik was not in that league. He was not up there. He was not anyone outside the sort of core old Muslim belt of Bombay, from say Mahim to Paidoni and Dongri. Anyone had really heard of him. He was not a national figure. He was not well known. There were far, far better known people. It's only when Peace TV comes about, largely with funding drawn from Didat's network, from wealthy, influential, diasporic Muslims who were, who saw one of his shows and liked it. That Peace TV became a cult thing. And that's because I think the stage was set for it, Marvi. There was nobody else really competing for this sort of leadership role among this new generation of people who were not necessarily mosque going, certainly did not see themselves as religious conservatives, but who wanted a kind of young men, mostly, overwhelmingly men, who wanted a religious language that would give them both legitimacy, but also a feeling of superiority over other Muslims, without leaving their living room, ideally, where it was air-conditioned and quite pleasant. And he tapped that, he got it. And I should mention also that this was a period in India where there was a new sort of Muslim middle class emerging in many cities. So these were young Muslims in the late 80s and the early 90s who benefited from liberalization. So there were opportunities in the private sector for the first time, where the sort of traditional modes of discrimination that kept Muslims out of government employment were kept out. The Muslim community in many areas had invested heavily in education, realizing it was the only real means to mobility. And Muslims were beginning to establish themselves in the IT sector, in business, in a number of spheres, but faced religious discrimination. This was the first encounter many of these communities had had with the wider milieu, if you like, of Hindu India, and weren't very welcome in it. And I think in these online fora, in satellite television, this became the beginnings of a sort of online virtual community of people who maybe weren't a community in a physical sense. But he saw it early. He saw it early and he tapped it and he milked it for everything it was worth.
Yeah. Where the money come? Did he charge for his lectures? He calls them lectures.
So IRF didn't formally charge a gate fee. There were no tickets for the audiences. In fact, if there's somebody watching this and knows what used to happen at similar events abroad, I'd be very curious to know, because I've not heard from anyone who went to these things. But in India, they wouldn't charge. But like I said, these physical events would be telecast, and they were stadium like. They're great fun. I'm sure you'll find many clips online with spotlights and spectacle. And it was a way for because it wasn't charged, it was a way for this to open the gates for people who might not want to go to a film night or a rock star event, or I don't know, Bollywood dancing or whatever people went to, but could nonetheless participate in an event that had, at least among their peers, some social cachet. Look at the Zakir Naik events. You will see nobody who's there who is poor. You'll see nobody there who's badly dressed. You'll see nobody over there who's struggling to survive, as the overwhelming bulk of Indian Muslims were. This is, remember, India was left with the poorest and least educated Muslims after partition. People who were better off and had opportunity largely went to Pakistan. And there's nothing in Zakir Naik about the real problems of the community. There's nothing about poverty. There's nothing about education. There's nothing about empowerment. So in that sense, you asked me the question about why the Congress liked him. And my answer would be probably those, because he didn't ask any questions. He had this Islam that seemed to be basically quietist, saying, have your beliefs, be very aggressive, say, gosh, Islam is superior, but don't ask any tough questions about why we don't have enough schools, or we don't have enough medical care, or we don't have enough economic opportunity. Those things you just stay away from. So like Salafism was in Saudi Arabia, this sort of Islamist radicalism was actually quite convenient and close to the political order of things.
I mean, what exactly was the business model then? Did
The business model was soliciting contributions from supporters, and the IRF got a lot of money from Salafist movements. Again, interesting because traditional, both religious movements as well as political Islamist movements in South Asia have been heavily dependent on Saudi Arabia, or one way or the other linked to Saudi Arabia's quest for influence and legitimacy. And the IRF broke with that revenue model. Its sources of support came from affluent diasporas in Africa and in the West, as well as in East Asia, where eventually Zakir Naik found refuge in Malaysia. And I suspect, with the Malaysians, with people in the UK as well, he was seen as this sort of new figure who was much more friendly, if you like, or more accessible than the traditional ulama of Saudi Arabia or of Al-Azhar might have been, even if there was no radical break in their worldviews. So, most clerics of any religion tend to be extremely misogynist, supremacist, insular. So Zakir Naik was all of those things, just like the traditional ulama you might get out of Saudi Arabia. But he packaged it much more slickly. And one of the reasons he found this audience in Malaysia was because of English. He's not preaching in Urdu or in Gujarati. He's preaching in English, and he's able to reach across frontiers all the way to the UK. His preachings are still, it wasn't until after 9/11 that he faced legal sanction in the UK, which was the first country actually to act against him. People forget this, but he faced legal sanction for his 9/11 speeches and a visa ban. And it was much later, actually, that India got around to actually bringing a criminal prosecution to bear. But until that point, until 9/11, he was seen as a quietist figure. I mean, he was an establishment kind of guy. Yes, he preached values that you and I find offensive. About women, about homosexuality, about personal rights, about individual freedoms, about free speech, about blasphemy, all of these things as positions.
I recently heard him saying things about transgenders.
Transgenders. I mean, he's reactionary, but I suspect his views are not fundamentally different from that of a village mullah or a padri or a Hindu priest. You'll hear the same kind of bigotry. It's just he took this bigotry and dressed it up in a thick coat of English, and that seemed to make him more acceptable somehow, maybe more dangerous.
Yeah. So why was Islamic Research Foundation banned? Let's come to the money point. How the money laundering was happening.
So after the ban that was imposed first by the UK and the ban on Zakir Naik entering the United Kingdom. A lot of questions began to be raised in India, and particularly on the political right, but also among secularists.
Is he still banned from UK?
Yes, he is. He continues to face a ban. I haven't followed the case, but to the best of my knowledge, the sanctions by the UK were never lifted. And probably there were some subsequent visa bans also. I mean, I'm pretty sure he would not have got a United States visa, though he never applied after 9/11. And after what he said about Osama. But questions after the UK ban began to be asked, both by the right and by some secularists, saying, wait a minute, why is the Indian government and the Congress party giving this guy a long leash? And this was a time when young Muslims associated with the Students' Islamic Movement of India, even people who had no direct role in acts of violence, but were being arrested in a big way, were being locked up, were being prosecuted on hate speech charges, on conspiracy charges. And people began to say, wait a minute, if you're locking this guy up, why does this other guy seem to get a free pass only because he wears a suit? And there was no very good answer forthcoming to all of this. And there was some noise made, but politicians began distancing themselves from Zakir Naik around that time. And particularly in Maharashtra, there was a lot of backlash because Bombay suffered repeated terrorist attacks. And people began to say, here is a guy who is less than equivocal in what he has to say about terrorism, who clearly makes hate speech. Uh, why are you not acting against this guy? And when Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government came to power, it came to I think it was really empowered by these kinds of questions. And in that sense, I think the Congress's failure to act uh, helped dig its political grave at that point. Because it was seen as hypocritical, because it was seen as just opportunist. Now, my personal take on that would be that the Congress was just as equivocal and pussyfooted around the question of Hindu nationalism as it did with Islamists. It tried to coexist with both and get away by not taking any stand on anything, and don't annoy anyone, don't annoy anyone. But this question was used very adroitly by Hindu nationalists in Bombay, saying, why is this guy there? And this was a question, of course, it was impossible to answer. And people began distancing themselves slowly. Now, the money laundering charges relate to the way in which the Islamic Research Foundation brought money to India to do its publicity, to run its media empire, to publish material. Under the Congress government, in fact, ironically enough, when P. Chidambaram was Home Minister, the rules on taking foreign contributions were made much harsher and tighter than they had previously been. And in fact, again, in one of those great ironies of history, the laws under which many well-meaning and good NGOs in India are now being targeted and shut down were brought in by a Congress government. But the IRF was found eventually of not complying with these things and receiving large amounts of money in cash donations and so on and so forth that bypassed foreign currency rules. And the principal charge is against him on that. But of course, he's also been found guilty of inciting communal hatred between communities, that is speech offenses. As you know, Marvi, I'm a personal and strong believer that people should be allowed to commit speech offenses. I hold free speech very, very dear, and I don't think it's the business of governments to decide what anyone, including Zakir Naik, should say. But I must also say that there are many, many people in jail serving long prison sentences for saying much, much less than Zakir Naik said and got away with for many, many years. So I have very little sympathy for his case.
So Zakir Naik and Bangladeshi government, what happened there?
Exactly the same story. There were terrorist group after terrorist group. I mean, virtually the entire leadership of the terrorist movement in Bangladesh. Sorry, just a second again.
Yeah, sure.
Virtually the entire leadership or important leaders of the terrorist movements in Bangladesh. You looked at their phones, you looked at their video feeds. They were in love with what Zakir Naik had to say. He was, in the same way, various sort of preachers close to Al-Qaeda became rock stars, though they didn't personally participate in violence. Zakir Naik occupied very much that role in Bangladesh. Remember, again, in Bangladesh, a lot of the people who were drawn to terrorism in the post 9/11 period were not veterans of the jihad in Afghanistan or hardened through the traditional mill. They were sort of young people coming out of universities, well-educated, English-speaking, who were looking for agency through this sort of participation in Islamist groups like Al-Qaeda and later on the Islamic State. And the Bangladesh government was extremely committed and, had become aware long before 9/11 that it had a very real problem. And this understanding, I should say, by the way, was not only with the last government in Bangladesh, with Sheikh Hasina, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's long government, but even towards the ending of the last government, an awareness had begun that, allowing terrorism to flourish will have some very, very dangerous implications for the Bangladeshi polity and civil society. And then, of course, there were unique considerations in Bangladesh having to do with the sensitivity of the Islamist message because of the origins of Bangladesh in a struggle which it cast as secularist. And Zakir Naik's propaganda just kept showing up everywhere. Now, as I say, again, you will never find a Zakir Naik speech that says, go kill Sheikh Hasina or go blow a bomb somewhere. But the anti-secularist, anti-constitutionalist message of his speeches clearly attracted these people in a way that preachers from Al-Qaeda's very Arab milieu, remember, almost everyone in the Al-Qaeda setup and in the Islamic State setup were guys who came from a very Arabic milieu and didn't really address South Asia. Zakir Naik did. He addressed young South Asians in a language and idiom that they understood and found attractive.
Yeah. What was his connection with the bakery attack in Dhaka?
The Holy Artisan Bakery attackers were all people who loved his speeches. There's absolutely no evidence that any of them was directly connected to Zakir Naik, but all had been enthusiastic followers and supporters of his speeches, his sermons, and were clearly, this was part of their process, of turning from being productive, rational members of a secular Bangladesh society into people who were willing to kill their fellow citizens in the name of Islam.
Yeah. There are people, mostly Pakistan again, they accuse that Sheikh Hasina Wajid's government as a puppet or satellite government of India, Modi's establishment, did whatever Modi government wanted her to do. And that is why Bangladesh
I'll say this about Sheikh Hasina. I think you can accuse her of a lot of things. You can accuse her of being authoritarian. You can accuse her of being undemocratic in her instincts. You can accuse her of authorizing the use of torture and state violence against Islamists and her political adversaries. But the lady was nobody's puppet. So I think, this is a fundamental misreading. And I think far more than Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Sheikh Hasina was acutely conscious of the reality of the Islamist threat in Bangladesh. Because in India, at the most, an Islamist movement can polarize Hindus and Muslims, but it's not an existential threat to the nation state. Hindu society is not going to fracture and fall apart and collapse because of acts of violence by Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. And I think Sheikh Hasina very clearly saw what had happened to many Muslim societies, including Pakistan and countries in the Middle East, because of religious fanaticism and the impact it had on those societies. And she understood that a Bangladesh that was grappling with desperate acute poverty would just lapse into bloodletting and savagery if this happened. Remember, in the 1971 war, the bloodletting was not primarily between the Indian army and the Pakistan army. It was one section of Bangladeshis, people of, if you like, ethnic Bihari origin. I'm using that word in inverted commas because I know it's very complicated. But it's between Islamists, people who are in the Jamaat-e-Islami, and between secular Bangladeshis. And there were savage killings. And she understood that if anything could fracture her country, it was allowing this kind of fanaticism to flourish again, and she was not going to have it. So again, people say she's a puppet of India. I don't think there's any dispute in my mind anyway that she was a Bangladeshi nationalist. Like many nationalists, she may have been authoritarian and misguided in many of the things she did. But I don't think her motives had to do with India. I think they had to do with a country. Remember, again, jihadist groups repeatedly assassinated members of her party, members of the Bangladesh National Party as well, assassinated progressive secular voices, bloggers, rationalists. She saw it for what it was, and she wasn't going to have some guy, preaching things that were dangerous for her society.
So what now? I mean, what are the key legal challenges that are
Well,
keeping India from extraditing?
very simply, that Malaysia is not going to extradite a figure who is widely popular among many young Malaysians. If Zakir Naik had been charged and convicted on charges of actual terrorism, as opposed to incitement to hatred or money laundering, I suspect it would have been different, and there might have been much more pressure from Western governments as well on Malaysia to hand Zakir Naik over for trial and to face his sentence. But I don't think there are realistic charges, and some charges, of course, like the foreign currency related charges, are not offenses under Malaysian law. It's an open economy. The same things that may be illegal are not illegal in Malaysia. The second is that in Malaysia, there is a deep undercurrent of sympathy for political Islam and Islamists. This has been part of the existential struggle in that country, even if it hasn't been a violent one as it has been in our part of the world. But it's very much an issue, and to be seen as handing over a popular figure who's got a huge rock star audience would involve a political price no Malaysian government would pay. Now, again, there's been pressure on Malaysia to curb extremism that's come from the West, that's come from Australia, and it's largely done that in the cases of actual violent terrorists, like ISIS supporters or Al Qaeda supporters. If you're, planning on becoming an ISIS jihadist, Malaysia isn't a good place. But if you're a foreign ideologue or a foreign, in Zakir Naik's case, ideologue is probably too glorified a word to use, maybe performer. Then Malaysia is a pretty welcoming place to be. It's been, it's annoyed many Middle Eastern governments as well by seeking to legitimize itself as a kind of, sanctuary and haven of traditional Islam.
About it during Imran Khan's government. So Imran Khan was
exactly. So it's a role model for a kind of modernist Islam, and I suspect Zakir Naik has found a nice home as well, because the Islamists of Malaysia, as opposed to young secularists or young women who don't necessarily welcome the country Malaysia has become, I suspect there are many Malaysians who would like to see things change, but there is a political and ideological struggle in that country which will play out in whatever time it plays out.
So has Indian government also, I heard there was reports, the Indian government has contacted Interpol for the arrest?
It can, and there is a red corner notice India has sought to bring, but there are a lot of legal complications. As I said, things like money laundering, for Interpol to act against someone, the evidence must be extremely compelling. A red corner notice is issued when a person, a red corner notice ultimately depends on both countries to implement. Interpol can't jump in and catch someone. And in many cases, a person who is considered a terrorist in one country will not be considered a terrorist in another country. To give an example, there are many, for example, Baloch nationalists who are sought by Pakistan as terrorists, but no European government would consider extraditing them. And this is a very similar situation. India can say what it likes to Interpol. But unlike in the case of someone who is clearly involved in acts of violence, pushing for action is extremely difficult.
Which means the case is not as strong as we would like it to be.
Well, the case is strong in the sense that if Zakir Naik ever comes back to India, there will be a trial. Who knows, there may even be, a long prison sentence waiting for him. But certainly not enough for, I think, for enough international pressure to be mounted on Malaysia to hand him over. Though no Western government would allow him to enter their territory in the first place. And probably he would be an unwise person to try, because there may be all kinds of problems that would follow from him. Ultimately, these are political decisions that countries make based on their values and their sense of the seriousness of the offense. And Malaysia obviously sees things very differently from the way India or some
Or
Western
other.
country might.
Yeah. In a recent interview with a Pakistani YouTuber, Dr. Zakir Naik said he did not go to Pakistan. I mean, he did not come to Pakistan after he, for exile. Because if he had gone to Pakistan, India would have said that Dr. Zakir Naik is an ISI agent. So he does not want this. Do you think India has this thinking back of the mind that he might?
I don't think anyone has seriously found anything to suggest Zakir Naik is an ISI agent. To the best of my knowledge, no law enforcement agency has made that claim. Having said that, I suspect the explanation for going to Malaysia is probably a lot simpler. I mean, let's face it, tens of thousands of people from both our countries every year go to Malaysia to work illegally. I don't think there are a lot of Pakistanis queuing up to come to India for asylum claims or to go to Pakistan for asylum claims. I think Dr. Naik just found a place he feels more comfortable and probably suits his lifestyle much more than Pakistan. I would be very, very surprised, let me put it that way, if he went to Pakistan. And quite honestly, other than poking India in the eye a little bit, I don't see what Pakistan's government thinks it's achieving by this either, because I would guess that in a atmosphere of extreme violence at home, of growing threats from the Tehreek-e-Taliban, Dr. Naik's message is probably not one that should be a good one for the Pakistani state. Yes, his message is very quietist. He doesn't encourage terrorism directly. But he's got a long record of inspiring young people to do things that they probably shouldn't be doing. And I'm surprised.
Yeah. So am I. Thank you. Thank you very much, Praveen, for your time. And let's see what happens in the visit. And we are watching with bated breaths what Dr. Zakir Naik
Yeah,
says.
I mean, sadly with Dr. Naik, there isn't very much to watch with bated breath. You can tell pretty much what he's going to say.
What he's going to say.
But yeah, interesting nonetheless, and an interesting moment.
Absolutely. So thank you very much. We have to leave it here tonight. Thank you, viewers, for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Marvi. Thank you. Bye-bye.